Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Michael Rocha. I'm a cardiologist at Hawthorne Medical Associates, director of the New Bedford Wellness Initiative, and a member of the COVID-19 Action Coalition. I'm very excited tonight to introduce our guest this evening, Dr. Laurie Santos, who is an expert on human cognition and the cognitive biases that impede better choices. She's a professor of psychology and the head of Silliman College at Yale University, and she developed the course Psychology and the Good Life that has been featured in numerous news outlets, including the New York Times, NBC Nightly News, The Today Show, GQ Magazine, Slate and O Magazine, a winner of numerous awards for her science and teaching. She recently was voted one of Popular Science's Brilliant 10 Young Minds and was named in Time Magazine as a leading campus celebrity. In these times of COVID-19, it is more important than ever that we focus on our well-being, and that means staying socially connected and being grateful for the things that we have. We're fortunate to have Dr. Santos join the New Bedford Guide, the New Bedford Wellness Initiative, and the COVID-19 Action Coalition and other community groups tonight on Facebook Live. In her talk, she'll talk about tips to find happiness and support our well-being in these trying times. And this will be followed by a question and answer session. We've collected questions from throughout the week previous, and also we'll be collecting questions from the comments tonight's show. Join us tonight, and let's build on our happiness today as we welcome Dr. Laurie Santos, who, by the way, was also a high school classmate of mine at New Bedford High School. We both graduated in 1993. Laurie, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike. It's wonderful to get back, not in homeroom with you, but to be here on Facebook Live together. I had originally planned on kind of giving a longish talk and to go through lots and lots of different tips to sort of find happiness during COVID. But I was amazed at the fantastic questions that you all gave me over the internet. And so I actually think that rather than kind of go through my own tips, I want to focus on what you want to learn more about, the specific questions that you have. And so if you've already sent in a question, thank you so much. If you haven't yet, you can post questions through the Facebook Live interface. Just pop your question in the Facebook Live chat, and then we'll be able to get to it. But I couldn't help but start with one tip before we kind of dig in and jump into the questions, which is just that we need to recognize what is actually going on right now, right? Like, we are in the midst of an awful global pandemic that is completely changing around our routines, that is literally killing people. And it's doing so in the context of an otherwise really polarized election year, a time when we're already kind of feeling stressed. Like, I say all this to note that it is normative to not be okay right now. If you were okay, you would be like a robot. You really kind of need to allow yourself to feel the negative emotions that come with living in a time like this. And this includes emotions like uncertainty, things like anxiety, sadness, frustration, anger. All of these are normative in a time that is this challenging and this stressful. And so one tip that I have for how you can process these emotions is something that we'll kind of dig into, I think, a bit more as we turn to the questions. But it's a meditation practice that really allows you to focus on your emotions and experience them. It's actually a meditation practice that I myself have been using a lot lately. The acronym for this meditation practice is known as RAIN. It's a practice that's been popularized by the meditation teacher Tara Brach, who's fantastic. You can get a lot of her free meditations on the app Insight Timer and on her website. But this meditation practice, RAIN, stands for the acronym Recognize, Allow, Investigate, and Nurture. And it's a practice that you can turn on whenever you're kind of experiencing a negative emotion. So I'll give you my most recent one. I was, just getting prepped for this sort of event, and I got an email that was pretty stressful that I kind of wasn't expecting. I was like, oh, I didn't even check my email before this event. That's when you kick into RAIN. You say, aha, recognize something bad's going on in my body. What is it? Right? And for me, I recognized, like, as I thought more, this is stress, right? This is fear as part of the email that came up. This is something that I'm frustrated by, right? Recognize and kind of call your emotions out. Sometimes when you're dealing with a young child, you can tell them, like, label things, like label your feelings, right? You as an adult need to do that too. So label your feelings. For me, it was like frustration, uncertainty, and a little bit of fear, right? And that's when you jump to the next step in the acronym, which is the A, which is allow. Allow those emotions to be there just as they are. I actually use the phrase, all right, you're cool. We're here now. I'm frustrated. I'm a little bit upset before this event. Like, just going to allow it to be there, right? It's kind of like a nasty neighbor who, sometimes comes over, at least pre-COVID, used to come over, like, you didn't want to hang out with them, but they're there now. So you just kind of let them be there, right? Allow your emotions just as they are. Then you do the I, which is to take a step to investigate what's going on. So I sit there, close my eyes. Okay, what's happening in my body? Like, oh, my chest is a little tighter than usual, right? My neck is kind of tensing up and sort of feeling in a way I don't like it. I'm very distracted, right? Whenever I feel a negative emotion, I want to run away. For me, it's like I want to eat something or check social media. I want to not be there with it, right? Notice what's happening in your body, both in terms of the physical sensations and what happens when you experience an emotion. Are you trying to distract yourself? Are you running away? What are you drawn towards? And then if you sit with it and sort of get curious and investigate, the research suggests that, your emotions will kind of pass over time. And that's sort of what I experience when I use this process. But that's when you get to the last step in the process, which is the N, which stands for nurture. As you would with a lot of compassion to a really good friend or a child, how would you nurture yourself in this moment? Again, not distract yourself or, do something that's going to make it worse. Like, what would you do to kind of give yourself some nurture? And for me, it's like sometimes self-talk, like, okay, this is going to be okay. Right. It's just a stupid email. Like, kind of let's get through this. Right. In a self-compassionate, not beating yourself up way, what can you do to sort of have some self-talk that feels good? I think this rain meditation can be an incredibly powerful practice for getting through a lot of the negative emotions that, again, are normative right now. It is normal to feel crappy when everything sucks as badly as it does in 2020. The key, though, is that you have to allow yourself to feel these emotions in a way that can let you process them, get through them, and get to the other side. And this rain technique has been really invaluable for me, and I bet it'll be a technique that'll help you too. And I'm sure it'll be one of the many techniques we talk about through the questions. But I just kind of wanted to give one formal tip before we get started. And now I'll kind of switch over to Mike, who I think has downloaded the many fantastic questions that you've already sent. But we, again, want to see more. Please be plopping your questions into the chat, and we'll be kind of looking at them as we go. Mike, do you want to dig into some of these questions?
Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you for that to sharing rain with us. So I'm going to start with this one here. And this one's near and dear to my heart, especially working in healthcare at this time. And, again, we had the opportunity in the spring to chat a little bit about, being in healthcare and what the stressors are. But here's a question. I'm a critical care nurse, and right now it's hard. It's really hard to remain positive with everything we are dealing with at work. My coworkers and I are experiencing insomnia and anxiety, things some of us have never dealt with in our lives. What suggestions do you have for those working with the actual front line, caring for COVID patients, and seeing the death and suffering at such high rates? Critical care was already a stressful environment, but this year has become astronomical.
I mean, let me first start by just validating that question and thanking the person who asked it, thanking them for their service, and everyone who's in healthcare who's watching this right now. Thank you, right? You are doing this amazing service to our community broadly. And, I have tremendous, tremendous gratitude for that. But the validation comes with like, yes, this is awful. I mean, this is awful for the rest of us. I cannot imagine what someone who's working in critical care is going through, right? The kind of stress and uncertainty of seeing these things, like kind of being overworked, right? Just the overwork part, ignoring the kind of crisis, ignoring the kind of death that you're seeing all the time, right? Facing human mortality so closely and in such awful circumstances where people are dying alone. Right. And the frustration that comes with the fact that maybe these circumstances could have been better. If the system was better, maybe if like government intervention was better, maybe if more people were following the rules and wearing masks, like we wouldn't be here. Right. So all those things together, from fear to anxiety to incredible anger and frustration, like there is a tremendous amount of negative emotion going on. And it's like, it's normal. It is normative negative emotion to kind of feel. Right. And so I think that's sort of step one, is to recognize that all that stuff you're going through is normal, right? Just because you work in critical care doesn't mean you're superhuman, right? And I think just giving yourself a little bit of self-compassion and some permission to feel that stuff is important, right? I think, a lot of people who are in the healthcare industry, I think are really kind of the type of people who like really want to work really hard, who have really meaningful and passionate goals. And sometimes that can come with a little bit of beating yourself up, right? Like I shouldn't feel insomnia, or I shouldn't be so upset. Like I should just be able to deal with this, right? No, you shouldn't. It is okay to kind of feel this way, right? Then the question is, what do you do with those feelings, right? Like, how do you kind of build yourself up and give yourself some resilience and some space to deal with those negative emotions? And that's a spot where I think a meditation practice like rain can be incredibly powerful. right? Take some time, even if it's like, in the little downtime you have, in the shower when you're coming home and you take your mask off, can you do that moment in the shower to kind of recognize, okay, what are the feelings that I'm feeling right now? Do that allowing and investigating. And then think about ways that you would really nurture someone else who is coming to you. That practice can be really, really important right now to kind of process those negative emotions. But I think an even more powerful practice that empirical research suggests is a different form of meditation practice. One that, if you've listened to my podcast, you might have heard about before. It's a meditation practice called loving kindness meditation. Now, all these meditation practices admittedly sound a little cheesy, right? Like, I'm a nerdy scientist. Like, I like things that sound very like concrete and scientific and evidence-based. When I say there's a practice called loving kindness meditation, it can sound a little like foofy, right? But the data suggests it's really not. This is a practice that in fact has been around for thousands of years. It's part of, old spiritual traditions like Buddhist traditions, but it's one that researchers in the modern day, even neuroscientists, have really embraced because the research suggests that it actually has some important empirical effects. So what's loving kindness meditation? It's like any other form of meditation where you take time and you sit and you sort of follow something. A typical meditation, you're sort of following your breath in and out. But in the context of loving kindness meditation, what you're trying to follow is your own physical feelings of experiencing compassion. And so compassion is a super interesting emotion, right? Compassion is your kind of motivation to help other individuals. It's different than empathy. Empathy is kind of taking on other people's pain, which if you do it too much, you can really get empathy fatigue and kind of want to back out and feel really burnt out. Compassion, the research suggests, is a little bit different. You don't necessarily get the same form of compassion fatigue because when you're turning on compassion, it is this motivation to care. It's kind of part of our old ancestral mammalian caregiving system. And so the act of turning on compassion can actually make you want and have the energy to kind of go forth and help others. And so this meditation practice is one where you kind of remind yourself what it feels like to experience compassion. In the practice, you sort of sit there, follow your breath for a couple seconds just to get grounded. And then you think of some individual that is really easy to give compassion to, that you have incredible, obvious, loving feelings for without any complications. So a child, a lot of people pick a pet, some cute animal that you really love. And then you say the following statements to yourself and notice how you feel. You say the statement, may that individual be happy. May that individual be safe. May that individual experience joy and be free from harm, right? You can kind of play along as we're talking on the Facebook Live, pick an individual to think that about. But the idea is when you start thinking about that, many people report a kind of feeling of calm, often a warm feeling kind of in their chest area, or sometimes like kind of in their body or something. That's this feeling of compassion. When you think of like a pet, a child, someone you love a lot, and you're like, may you be happy, that feeling is what compassion is. And so this compassion meditation basically trains that. And so you start with an individual who's super easy. Then you go to other individuals who are relatively easy, maybe a spouse or a good friend, may you be happy, may you be safe, may you be free from harm. And then gradually you work up to harder and harder individuals. First you pick somebody who's neutral, maybe, the barista at the coffee shop you used to go to, or, a neighbor who you don't know very well. May that person be happy, may they be safe, may they be free from harm. And then the key is that you pick somebody who's kind of tough, not the toughest person in the world, but somebody you've had some conflict with. And really think about what it would feel like to express to that individual, may you be happy, may you be safe. And the idea is that this practice allows you to extend compassion more and more broadly, and sometimes to individuals that are really quite hard. Another key of this practice is at some point in that practice, it kind of varies depending on how hard this is for you. At some point in the practice, you stick yourself in there. You think, may I be happy, may I be safe, and may I be free from harm. For some people, self-compassion is pretty easy. For people that are hard on themselves, maybe yourself is like, past a bunch of people you have conflict with. Maybe it's really hard to extend your self-compassion. Okay, so that's the process. It can take like 3 to 5 minutes, if you kind of sit and take time to do it. What are the benefits? Well, the research suggests that this regular practice has a whole host of important benefits. One, like most forms of meditation, it can help you do things like increase your concentration, increase your well-being, because it's a kind of practice where you stop mind wandering all the time, and just being present is a way to increase your well-being. But it's specifically relevant for those in healthcare and specifically critical care, because the research suggests that exercising your compassion in this way is kind of like doing bicep curls for the emotion you need to feel resilient when you're faced with other people's pain a lot. And in fact, there's some research by Tanya Singer and her colleagues showing that if you allow healthcare workers to do these forms of loving kindness meditation as a regular practice, you can actually see reduced symptoms of burnout. In part because those things that are normally burning you out, you've kind of built up your muscles to kind of deal with more of them. And I actually think that as a practice that would take you, 3 to 5 minutes a day, it's kind of a nice way to sort of buffer yourself. Many of you have, as healthcare workers, sort of built up the resilience you need to like stand all day and maybe not drink water and, wear the PPE and all this stuff. But you also need to build up your emotional muscles to deal with the kind of tough things you're facing, literally death, literally people's bad decisions. Like you face a lot of people who you might feel annoyed with. And this kind of form of compassion meditation can really help. So one of my biggest suggestions to everyone who's in healthcare today to do is, download a 3 to 5 minute loving kindness meditation. There's some free ones on my podcast. There's a bunch of free ones on the app Insight Timer. That's the one I use. Again, it's called loving kindness, or sometimes metta, METTA, which is the Sanskrit word. Again, powerful, powerful practice and empirically proven to reduce burnout. And the good news is it doesn't actually take that long. The final thing that this practice does, which I think again is important for healthcare workers, is it's a powerful technique for allowing you to increase your self-compassion, not beating yourself up, recognizing when you really need to take a break and that you're at your breaking point, because ultimately you deserve to be happy. You need to be free from harm too. And it's a powerful way to remember to put your own oxygen mask on first before you're helping other people, to make sure you're getting what you specifically need. Research suggests that people who do these kinds of practices and especially engage with this may I be happy kind of mantra too, you can bump up your own self-compassion in a way that allows you to protect yourself. And so those would kind of be my tips for the healthcare folks. Like, again, start with recognizing that these emotions are normative, they're okay, and they need some space and some expression. The amazing thing is you don't need to take that much time. If you actually sit with emotions and allow them and investigate them, you can get through them. And then to build, to do these bicep curls for your own compassion through these practices like loving kindness meditation, a fantastic way to reduce burnout, even in a totally awful time.
So as a follow-up, there was a two-part question that came from someone in healthcare, which I think that you addressed through this. The two-part question was, how do we avoid apathy, which I think you addressed there. But also, this lack of empowerment amongst healthcare workers, because there is this kind of feeling of helplessness, that, we're doing all this work, and, how do we get around this helplessness that we may be feeling?
Yeah. I mean, helplessness is a natural reaction when you feel like you're out of agency, right? And when your empathy is so fatigued, you just can't do it anymore. Like, it's a completely natural reaction. The good news is that, again, there are techniques we can use to feel emotions that allow us to be motivated in a different way. So I mentioned this idea that compassion is this motivating emotion. It's like our caregiver emotion of like, oh, I have resilience, I want to jump in there and do it. Different than empathy in an important way. So that's one emotion you can kind of boost up to kind of get some oomph back, right? It's kind of the opposite of apathy, right? It's an emotional charge to say like, I'm going in to help, like a mom going to protect their kids, right? It gives you energy is what the research really suggests. Many pro-social emotions allow us to do that. Like they actually come with the opposite of apathy, where you care a lot and it kind of builds you up with some energy to do better. And another one of these pro-social emotions that I bet we'll kind of talk about a lot today is gratitude. Again, something that must feel hard when you tell healthcare workers like, hey, you should feel gratitude right now. Admittedly, like this is a crappy situation and there's a lot to legitimately gripe about. The problem with griping, though, is that it's an opportunity cost on something else you could do that will build up your resilience, that will help you overcome that apathy. And that is this practice of gratitude, simply taking time to count your blessings. This is a terrible, awful, awful situation. There's no two ways about it, but there's still moments of joy and moments of times that you feel really thankful. Thankful for your other, people in the community who are helping out. Thankful for the people, and there are many of them out there who are following the rules, making sacrifices to make sure other people stay safe. Thankful just for, your own health right now, as precarious as it is, you have it right now, or the health of your family, or just, that you're above ground today, right? Again, in a pandemic, this is not a given, right? And so the key is to kind of harness this mechanism of counting your blessings. And the reason to do that is, again, because gratitude is a pro-social emotion, it is kind of forward moving, right? It gives us this sort of motivational oomph. There's evidence to suggest that people who experience more gratitude actually have more willpower. Willpower in part because usually when you experience gratitude, you feel like, oh my gosh, my life is so full. I want to give back to other people. It gives you the energy to want to give back. And one of the people it gives you energy to give back to is like, your future self. So there's evidence that people who feel more grateful are more likely to save for retirement, more likely to save money into the future. People who feel more grateful are more likely to eat more healthily, in part because, again, you're kind of ready to sacrifice right now for a future cause. And so as ironic as it is, I think healthcare workers can really help themselves by engaging in practices of gratitude. Again, not because, there's nothing to gripe about. There's tons to gripe about. It's just strategically, it's not helping. It's making things worse. It's making the apathy worse. One way that you really do have control and can take charge is through your own emotions, is by bumping up your own compassion and your own gratitude. Again, we can't change the system. We can't, we can try to convince everyone to wear masks and do the right thing. People are going to violate those rules. It's awful, but it's true. Those are things that you can't control. But your emotions is one thing that you can. And once you start doing it, especially once you start harnessing emotions that can give you that motivational oomph, then you realize you have control back. Now you feel things like hope. Now you feel things like meaning. Now you feel things like energy. And those emotions are there for you. They don't even take that much time. Just, a few simple minutes a day can give you some of these things back.
Yeah, that makes me think a little bit about the difference between reaction and response. If we can kind of have a little bit more time between the stimulus, then we may be able to kind of handle those situations that arise. And I would tell you that I'm incredibly grateful for the community that I live in, and for the people that I'm working with in the office and at the hospital. Again, what I see is that people are doing really amazing things. They may not even recognize those things. And I think that what happens is that, if we all just catch ourselves doing just amazing things and letting people know, I think that's one other way that we can potentially make sure that, we keep that, momentum and togetherness. I mean, really, again, Vivek Murthy, who wrote a wonderful book called Together, has really been talking a lot about loneliness. And one of the things that happens, I think, in medicine a lot of times is we feel like Lone Ranger. People try to feel like, they're very, isolated. And I think that we need to really kind of figure out how we can come together.
Yeah. No, I think that's so the togetherness is so important, recognizing that we're all in this. I think if you're in healthcare, if you could just commit every day to express gratitude to someone else on your team very explicitly, imagine the sheer amount of kind of boosting of well-being that could give within organizations, right? To people who really, really need it. And if you're someone who's in the community who's not in healthcare, find a way to express gratitude to someone who is. They need to hear that, right? But I also wanted to kind of explore a little bit this idea of the difference between the reaction and the response, because I think that's really critical. Again, part of the frustration in the current time is it feels like everything is out of our control, especially for people in healthcare, but just for people in general, right? This pandemic feels like it's been going on forever. I don't know when it's going to end. There's very little I can do. Yeah, I can wear a mask and socially distance. Of course I'm going to do that. But it feels like I have relatively little control over this big thing that's happening, that I can't sort of do anything about, right? And the one thing, again, you need to remember that you can do something about is your own emotions and your own reactions. We always have control over those. And this gets to one of my favorite stories that comes from the Buddhist tradition. It's the sort of parable of the second arrow. And so the parable goes something like this. Buddha is talking with one of his followers, and he asks his follower, is it bad if you're walking down the street and someone shoots an arrow and hits you? And the follower says, yeah, it's pretty bad to get hit with an arrow. It's not a good thing, right? So then Buddha says, well, what would happen if you're walking down the street? In addition to getting hit with the first arrow, you also got hit with a second arrow on top of that. And his followers say, yeah, that would be worse. 2 arrows, definitely worse than 1. And so Buddha goes on to say, we can't control the first arrow. Those are just the circumstances of life. That's like the poop happens. That's the Laurie version, not the Buddha version, but the poop happens of life, right? We can't control that. But the thing we can control is the second arrow. That's our reactions to things. That's if we go through this crisis and, get pissed off and yell at our spouse and don't do any self-care and kind of react with frustration to things. We can control that second one. It takes work. admittedly, and it takes work at a time when we're all feeling depleted. But the consequences of taking action on that are twofold. One is that we can get to behaviors that allow us to get more resilience. We can make it better if our reactions are better. And the second thing is the act of doing that gives us more resilience, right? It means it'll be easier not to stab ourselves with the second arrow next time. And so, I sometimes remind my friends, even who are going through this period and having a tough time, like, yeah, it's a tough time. First arrow sucks, and it's a big first arrow. But how many of the stabs and how much of the pain is you stabbing yourself with the second arrow? Doing the wrong things, drinking too much, not sleeping, not doing self-care, not taking time to acknowledge and recognize that it's sucky, not taking a break, right? Those are second arrows that you're stabbing yourself with. And we have to control over that. Like COVID, that's not on us. But our reactions, for better or for worse, are kind of on us.
You just mentioned something that made me think about one of the articles that you wrote a few months ago about, self-care not being selfish, and I think that's a really important thing for that, if you could take a few minutes to talk about that.
Yeah, I think, I guess we get self care wrong in a couple ways, right? One is that, we tend to not like culturally be all that into self compassion, right? We tend to be, when we think about doing good things and forming good habits and getting happier, we can often go into like mean drill sergeant mode of like, raw, like do it, do it, do it, and just kind of being really mean to ourselves. But again, this is one of the spots where our mind is lying to us about what's going to be most effective. The data suggests that mean drill sergeant approach, telling yourself you're stupid or you suck or like, you got to do better, like that just doesn't work. What works is treating yourself with some compassion, self compassion, right? Kind of like extending the same courtesy to yourself as you would to someone you care about. In the Bible, it talks about do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I don't think we should really be doing unto others as we do to ourselves, because a lot of us are really mean to ourselves, right? Don't take breaks, like just get really we just don't treat ourselves with a lot of care a lot of time. And sadly, that's often the first thing to go when times get rough, right? Is the kind of care with which we give ourselves. So what can you do to turn on that mammalian care system for yourself, right? That's what self-care is really about. It's not like buying bubble baths or like, like doing the self-care stuff that you sort of see on the internet that requires you to buy something. It's extending your self-care. And that comes in a couple different forms. One is like really thinking of ways you can be kind to yourself, right? Like how you would be to a good friend. How would you react in helping a good friend? Can you extend that to yourself? Another is a sort of sense of mindfulness, and mindfulness in a particular way where you have the bandwidth to notice what's going on with yourself. It's hard to be nice and take care of yourself if you're not taking time to sort of notice what's going on. And finally, it's mindfulness in this way of sort of recognizing two features. One is to non-judgmentally do stuff, right? You're not a drill sergeant. You're just acknowledging, hey, I'm going through a tough time, right? Non-judgmentally, that sort of allowing that we talked about in the rain meditation. And then finally, self-compassion also has this wonderful component that gets back to this issue of loneliness that we mentioned before. Because, one thing you do when you're being really mindful and self-compassionate is to realize, hey, this is just human nature, right? Suffering is a thing. It's just going to happen. Failure is a thing. You're human, right? Frailty is a thing. You're human. And in some sense, the fact that you're going through a tough time, the fact that you require self-compassion is a way to connect you with like the rest of humanity, right? You're kind of part of society in a rich way and part of like a community of people who are going through the same thing together. You're not like a special snowflake who's going to be perfect all the time. You got to extend yourself some self-compassion. And so I think this is the thing we forget about self-care, right? Is that it really isn't about, like buying stuff or, or even things that are really selfish, if it's meaning selfish in that kind of drill sergeant way. It's about really giving ourselves some care in the same way we would help someone else. And, if that feels like a struggle to you or you think that's weak or things, check out some of the work on self-compassion. Check out some meditations on Insight Timer and elsewhere by the researcher Kristen Neff, who's an expert on self-compassion. And do some practices where you really deliver yourself some care. Really powerful technique, again, that the research shows is motivating. There's one study showing, this is a study out of UC Berkeley, that tried to see if whether or not people are more motivated to deal with things like failure and deal with tough times when they extend themselves self-compassion. We think self-compassion can be weak, but the data suggests it's quite powerful. So UC Berkeley, they did a study where they brought students in, they gave them the super impossible task. So all the students failed. And, as students normally do, their normal reaction would be to beat themselves up. Oh my gosh, I suck, drill sergeant, drill sergeant. But then they gave half of those students the opportunity to experience self-compassion. They taught them techniques that they could use to give themselves some care. And what they looked at was that which of the students kept studying, which of the students went back to that, tough problem to try to figure it out. And it was basically the students who experienced the self-compassion. Why? Because they're not beating themselves up, right? There's this opportunity to fail. You're just like everybody else, right? And they know they're going to have the support and care if they mess up again, right? And so far from being a way to be weak or like, making us complacent, giving ourselves self-care can be a powerful technique for not only doing better, because if you're more motivated and you're more going to work harder, you're going to do better, but also to just like exist in this way where we're not beating ourselves up all the time.
Yeah. Well, I just want to take a moment to let everybody know that it looks like we're casting a wide net, and apparently we're hitting quite a few different countries throughout the world, and we'd like people to let us know where you're tuning in from, quite frankly. So thank you for everybody that's tuning in, and I'm going to probably switch gears a little bit to another topic, which obviously is something that is at the forefront of many people's issues, and many people are struggling with anxiety. And we had quite a few questions that asked about, anxiety in various aspects, both personal and for others. And I'd like to start with the first question is, how do we support a relative or friend who is suffering from anxiety secondary to this pandemic? How do we support them?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one way is to check in, to ask someone how they're doing, right? Not a like, hey, how's it going? It's fine. Be like, how are you doing? I'm really worried about you, right? Could I be a resource for you, right? Also, a second thing to do is to kind of start the way I started here today, which is to express that it's okay, right? You're not a weakling if you're experiencing anxiety right now. You are like a normative human and not a robot, right? And so I think starting by kind of making it clear that it is okay to experience those things, that you're part of a bigger community, that this is something that everyone goes through, and that you can be there as a support can be a powerful mechanism of helping someone.
There's another question here that kind of looks at a particular group of people out there that may be at higher risk for developing complications for COVID. And, again, one of the things that I think that we've seen most recently is the spread of COVID, at least in the United States, has predominantly been in our younger population, our 20 to 40-year-olds. And what we're seeing is that there's been less cases, at least in Massachusetts, of, the 70 plus. And what we do know about COVID, obviously, is that those that have chronic diseases and those that are older have a higher risk of developing a more serious case of COVID and complications. And this question, that from one of our questions that was sent in earlier this week, says, how do I find more joy when I feel so anxious and trapped by mainly staying at home during COVID-19? I'm 67 years old, I live alone, and I have an underlying health condition which puts me in the high risk category. So, again, this is what some of these people are dealing with. And we know that, again, we just had Thanksgiving, and, we had the younger population that may have come in contact with some of, our older, more vulnerable populations. What's the message to those vulnerable people out there that are experiencing anxiety?
Yeah. I mean, well, again, the first part of the message is just to validate that. Like, it's scary. It's scary if you don't have an underlying health condition, right? If you're in a situation where exposure to this virus has the possibility of being even worse for you, of course, that's going to be more scary. Of course, you're going to experience anxiety. And so I guess message number one is not to beat yourself up. That is normal. That's what's supposed to happen in this context, right? Is to experience some anxiety. Then the second question is, how can you regulate that, right? I think this is a wonderful spot to use a technique like RAIN, where when you experience it, you recognize it, you allow it to kind of play through, like, where's that anxiety coming from? Investigate what it feels like and stay with that, right? Use a technique where you kind of measure where your anxiety is. Like, is it at a 10? Can you sit with it at a 10 for 1 minute? Just breathe and, clench your hands and see what that feels like, right? Be a powerful way to kind of investigate and allow those emotions ultimately. Another way to deal with anxiety, again, is to remember that part of anxiety, what it is an activation of your fight or flight network, part of your sympathetic nervous system. This is the system that like is built evolutionarily to kind of fight back if you have a threat. So if a tiger jumps out, you're supposed to be scared. You're supposed to experience all the things that come with anxiety physically from that so that you can kind of run away, right? The fight or flight system's mostly built for threats that are temporary. Tiger jumps out, you run away or you flee, all good, right? It's not really built for threats like COVID. They're going to stick around for months and months and months indefinitely, right? And so it can be really bad to be running this system. The good news is that we have a couple ways to hack the fight or flight system. And one of them is actually through our breath. If you have treatment for anxiety, you know that there's often these sort of breath-based approaches where you take a deep breath, these deep breathing techniques. And those techniques are there in part because they're intervening on that fight or flight system. It's kind of awesome, right? It's like we don't have many ways to intervene on a system that's typically unconscious, but our conscious breaths can actually help with that through the activation of the vagus nerve. Basically, what you do when you take a bunch of really deep belly breaths is you turn on the opposite system, the parasympathetic nervous system. This is our kind of rest and digest system that we need for normal things like digestion and sleep and immune function and so on. And the good news is just through the act of taking a couple really slow, deep belly breaths, you can activate that system. Is it going to get rid of, take a few deep breaths and you get rid of your anxiety forever? No, of course not, right? But it's a way to kind of help that system. It's a way to come down from like 10 on the anxiety to the 8. And it can give you the space you need to kind of make good decisions. But ultimately, the thing you have to do if you're in that situation is to stay really safe, right? And kind of be there with that sacrifice. But the act of kind of regulating the fight or flight, that really hardcore anxious response, that can be quite powerful for doing what you need to do. Then there's a question of how you find joy in that system. Like first we regulate the anxiety, then we ask, okay, how can I actually feel joy? And that's a spot where I think we need to go back to the basics in terms of some of our happiness. The first is trying to find some connection, and that connection shouldn't be live, hopefully, without masks inside if you're, experiencing, if you want to kind of stay healthy, right? But there are lots of other ways we can connect with other people. We're doing it right now over Facebook Live. There's lots of techniques like FaceTime or Zoom. But if you're not comfortable with those, hopefully you're still comfortable with picking up the old-fashioned phone. We forget now that we have, computers and Zoom technology, like we could still pick up the phone. Like it's still a wonderful way to connect with other people. And I think that if you're looking for joy, you need to kind of put a little bit more work and intention, and you kind of need to schedule this stuff. But the good news is that that work and intention to scheduling some of these things can be quite powerful. So I think finding joy by connecting with other people is quite powerful. Again, to connecting not in person, but in real time over the phone or something like that. The other thing is to just make sure you're finding space for joy in your own life. What are things that have allowed you to find joy in the past? And can you find versions of those things that you can do during this time? And that can be like the simple stuff, really going back to the basics, right? Like savoring a good cup of coffee in the morning, like watching some funny videos or comedy movies that you used to enjoy, right? Find ways to go back to the basics. Literally write down a list of things that used to give you joy. Some of them we won't be able to do during COVID. It sucks. We're admitting that. Full disclosure, there will be some stuff that you're going to have to cross off the list or modify. But there's a lot of stuff there that you can still do. How can you build that back in? As you start, once you start and you get this process rolling, it becomes easier to do more and more. Once you make the first step, once you take some baby steps, all of a sudden it becomes easier to do bigger and bigger things that get you more and more joy.
One of the things in terms of our well-being, you talked about some of the techniques for anxiety, which may be some certain meditations and various other things. We're in a situation now and that physical activity has been reduced for many people in certain situations. There's less people going to gyms. There's less people that may be active. Can you talk a little bit about how physical activity or what opportunities people could safely engage in some activity that and what does the science say about physical activity and our emotional and mental well-being?
Yeah, well, they're really, really related, as I'm sure in your own practice, right? Lots of evidence suggesting that, like, a simple half hour of cardio exercise a day can do things like reduce symptoms of depression and can reduce symptoms of depression in some studies, even as well as a prescription for an antidepressant medication. There's also evidence that a half hour of cardio can lead to long-lasting boosts in well-being. So you do a half hour of cardio, 9 a.m. on Monday. How long do you get that kind of endorphin well-being boost? Seems to last, at least in some empirical data, to like Tuesday at 2 p.m. So over 24 hours of boost for like a half hour of moving your body. And so this is a problem for those of us who might not be able to get to our gym, who might just be like walking around less because we're kind of stuck in the house more, right? How do you deal with that? Well, again, this is a spot where you have some agency. Just because your gym is closed doesn't mean you can't move your body. And one of the awesome things about COVID-19 is that influencers and people in the fitness world, they've had to adapt too. And if you just like YouTube, like 10-minute fitness video, like 10-minute HIIT class, 10-minute yoga, you'll find tons and tons of free resources that you can engage with from your house. No gym stuff required, like a towel that you throw on the floor is kind of all you need. And you can often do it in small spaces. You can even Google, small space 10-minute activity. And I keep saying 10 minutes because I think that's another reminder. Sometimes we think, oh, if I can't go to the gym and run for like, a whole hour on the treadmill, I can't do anything. Nah, even if you've got 10 minutes here and there, you can do that. All of us right now, if we wanted to, while you're watching this, could do like, 10 jumping jacks right now. And that's a start. And so that'd be my advice for people who, let their movement sort of fall by the wayside a little bit. Like build it in baby steps. Can you just do 5 minutes of moving your body a little bit? Most of us can squeeze that in, and do it at your own level, right? Again, this doesn't mean run a marathon. This means move your body, do something with your body in a way that feels good. And I think importantly, it's the feels good for your body, not makes your body look good. Makes your body look good can get us into all kinds of domains that just make us feel bad about ourselves and pull out that drill sergeant and make us not be very self-compassionate. But moving in a way that makes your body feel good is something that everybody can embrace.
I agree. Yeah, for me, I've been spending more time hiking than I ever have, wearing a mask, and we've been fortunate that we've been able to go back to our walk with a doc with masks, distanced, and proper hygiene, and we've been able to make some connection, but do it in such a way that everybody's safe. And we actually just finished, as part of the International Walk with a Doc, a virtual Kilimanjaro challenge. So it was kind of a nice way that we were able to virtually connect with, thousands of other walkers and docs throughout the world. And I still think, like you said, trying to do things safely and connecting, and, just 5 minutes here and there it makes a difference. And, I think that, getting outside a little bit for some fresh air and not feeling like we're trapped, if we can use the proper, protection, is really, really important.
Yeah, and you mentioned another piece that's really important, which is the social connection part, right? For me, a lot of my social time these days is actually exercise time. Out hiking safely and socially distanced, like you mentioned, outside, but also these online fitness classes. I've been doing a lot of like Zoom yoga classes with friends where, I'll find some YouTube class that's free that I want to watch, and I go on Zoom or go on FaceTime or something with a friend, and we both sort of do it together. Right. And that helps for a couple reasons. One is you get the social connection boost, right, which is awesome. You also like feel like a loser if you don't show up. You tell your friend, I'm going to show up at 9 and do yoga, and you don't show up. Right. So it's a pre-commitment, right? It's a way to kind of make yourself commit to it. It also just makes it more fun, right? Like it's kind of more fun to do yoga with a friend. So big into like socially connected exercise. It helps you in many, many, many different ways.
I'm going to segue to something that, you talked about doing things differently then. There's a question here that talks about many people actually took the opportunity under these difficult times to develop new skills during the pandemic: arts, crafts, knitting, painting, and other creative ventures, when we put down into, again, the restrictions that many of us have experienced. One of the problems that this person said, however, many others, myself included, felt stifled when it came down to doing creative work. The uncertainty of the world and the anxiety it provoked was just too overwhelming. What would you say to folks who have struggled during COVID-19 so they can learn to embrace the creative side and feel themselves again? So I guess, how do people take the first step is really what it sounds like, right?
Yeah. And I think, one way I would start by answering this question is like, yeah, like you're not going to be the most artistic, creative person during a global, horrible national pandemic, right? You're just not. Like, I'm not going to be the best professor this semester. I'm not going to be the best spouse this semester. If you're a parent, you're not going to be the best mom. Like, this sucks, right? And it's going to deplete us, and that's okay. That is normative, right? Like, you would be a strange superhero robot if that weren't the case. And so part of my answer to this question is just to allow some self-compassion, right? Part of the reason those creative juices might have gone away is the stress of the pandemic and all that stuff, but part of it is the lack of self-compassion that's going on with that, right? One way to really kill your creative urges is to beat yourself up, right? That fear of failure is not great for like your creativity to start flowing, right? And so, practice number one might be to engage in a little self-compassion. Come around to the fact that, like, yeah, of course, like, unremarkable that I'm less creative than I was before, right? The other thing is that to kind of nudge it a little bit against the sort of social comparison that was sort of implicit in that question, right? Like everybody else is baking bread and everything's perfect. That's in part because people put out there the parts that are awesome. You put the awesome Pinterest picture of the sourdough. You don't put the part where you just like, hide in your slippers and watch Netflix for 3 days because you couldn't bear to get out of bed, right? But I guarantee you, everybody who looks like they're kind of engaging with their creative passion has a little bit of that too. Again, because they're human, right? That's what we're all going through. But I think that there are still steps you can take to take control over this stuff, right? One is, again, engaging in these practices that allow for self-compassion, right? The other is kind of engaging in these simple practices that allow you to kind of get away from some of the uncertainty, to get away from the stress of things. Again, half hour of cardio, right? I guarantee you, if you do a tough hit class and finish that, you'll be in a little bit more of a better zone to do something creative. Again, not at the level that you're used to, right? None of us are going to be 100% right now, but you can get back up to 70%, 80% with these kinds of techniques.
I think you brought up a very good point just now that I'd like to follow up with another question. And I think this is maybe a balance question, quite frankly, is in your course, you talked a lot about the damage of social media. So as you just said, we're making comparisons to others. I was wondering if that it's changed this year and how has it been a fundamental survival tool, social media, for isolated people?
Yeah, I think sometimes people get a mistaken idea of my take on social media, right? People will be like, "You hate social media. Why are you doing this?" We're on, so we're like contributing to social media right now, right? And I
Right.
think that kind of gets to the crux of it, right? Social media is just a tool. We can use it in a variety of different ways. The question is, are you personally using it in ways that are boosting your happiness? Are you using it in ways that feel nutritious? Do you feel energized afterwards or depleted afterwards, right? And it's going to depend a little bit on what kinds of social media tools you use. My guess is if it's, mindlessly scrolling because you're distracting yourself away from your emotions and pain and like, not really participating, maybe not good. If you're using these techniques to actually connect with people in real time, maybe better. Maybe if you're using it to sort of think about things that you're grateful for or following people, like for a while on Twitter, I was following the hashtag COVID kindness and just seeing examples of people doing great things during COVID. Like those are great, right? So part of it is how you're using it, what the content is. Part of it is sort of when you're using it. Again, why did you turn to this tool? Was it to run away because you were feeling distracted? Was it at an opportunity cost of in real life social connection you could get? How many times have my husband's been talking to me, I'm like, and I'm checking something on the internet. I'm like, what did you just say, right? That was an in real life social opportunity that I just missed out on, right? Because I was looking at something on the internet. And so one of the tools I've been using in general, but especially during COVID, comes from a podcast conversation I had with the journalist Catherine Price, who's fantastic. She has this wonderful book called How to Break Up with Your Phone. And it's it's like a over the top title. She doesn't really think you need to break up with your phone. But what she talks about is ways to kind of mindfully interact with your phone in a way that feels more nutritious. And she has this wonderful acronym she uses whenever she's on social media, but whenever she picks up her technology generally, because we kind of, poop on social media a lot, but honestly, I've been distracted just as much by my email or, high intensity election coverage or just like, anything on the internet, right? Those screens can be distracting us. And so whenever you pick up your phone, she has you use this acronym WWW, and it stands for what for, why now, and what else. So when you pick up your phone, what was it for? We've all had this moment where like, I'm looking up a recipe or I'm going to check the weather. And then like moments later, you're in this like rabbit hole of Facebook, or looking at scary stuff about COVID, right, on the news that you didn't intend, right? What was the original goal? And was there like really a goal? Was it for anything, right? The next question is sort of why now, right? Was there a particular purpose that you needed to do it now? Were you bored? Maybe you were anxious. Maybe you were like distracted. Maybe, like get a sense, be mindful, non-judgmentally. Like, why did you really do it? What is going on? This can help you figure out your habits of like why you pick these things up. And maybe if there's a better way to kind of deal with whatever that reason was. And that gets to the third thing, which is what else, right? We have finite time on this planet, right? Every moment that we're spending on Facebook or a moment that we're spending on Instagram is a moment that we can't be doing something else because it's gone, right? What else could you have done with that time, right? When I'm checking my email, that's a time that I could be like chatting with my husband. When I'm on Instagram, that's a moment that I could be doing a 5-minute HIIT class or a 5-minute rain meditation, right?
Yep.
What is the opportunity cost that you're missing out on? And so that process can allow, if you kind of engage with a process like that, the answer is sometimes no, it was social media. Like I really wanted to go on and, take a look at my friends, like, I don't know, baby pictures or something. Like it can be there for good, or I really wanted to go on Facebook Live and watch this, session about well-being in COVID, right? There are good things you can use it for. It's when it's not working for you nutritiously. So if you do that kind of mindful exercise, pay attention to what's nutritious and build in more of the nutritious parts and hopefully less of the not so nutritious parts.
We're going to take a pause for just a second for a couple of comments that have been sent through.
Thank you, Regina. That's awesome. Thanks, Geraldine. That's fantastic.
Thanks for all the comments out there. There's been so many. There's no way we're going to get to everything. So I hope that people don't feel that that we're trying to ignore anything. But we've got a lot of things and a lot of information to go through tonight. So we'll keep an eye on things, and certainly we'll take a look at the comments afterwards as well and take a look to see what else we could do. I'd like to actually, so one of the things that we do know is that there is a dark side to social media, as you alluded to there. And, also, one of the things we're trying to deal with is the negativity or the negative people in our lives.
Yep.
And, unfortunately, one of the things that happens on social media is that people can make comments that can be very damaging at times. And the repercussions of not either having that real relationship between the person, can be very harmful. So I'm going to turn a little bit towards, how do we deal with some of the negative people in our lives? Because that was actually, we got several questions about that this week. So one of them is, how do we stay positive when those around us aren't? How do we, again, when we're dealing with somebody that's just, no matter what, seems to be in that negative mindset, how do we deal with that person? Because we may not have the option of just kind of getting away from that situation, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the frustrating things about COVID is that, if you live with that person or if you're stuck with them, you might be more stuck than usual, right? And you might have less opportunities to see other people if you're around a negative person, right? And so, validating, like that's tough. It's already tough in a situation, but this is again another spot that you have a lot of control over things, right? One form of control you have, which seems surprising, but it's quite powerful, is to regulate your own emotions, right? I often get questions about like, I'm a parent, my child is so anxious. What can I do to regulate anxiety? Like maybe work on your own anxiety, work on your own happiness levels, right? All these techniques I'm mentioning, things like taking time for gratitude, thinking about exercise, social connection. Those are things that you can do that will change your own emotions. You will get happier. And just as that other negative person's emotions are affecting yours, so too are your emotions affecting that other person. There's research by the Wharton professor Sigal Barsade on what she calls affective spirals, right? And you've all seen this at work. If you go to work and there's some negative person, like you kind of catch the negativity and then you go home and you're in a bad mood and that makes your spouse in a bad mood and your kids in a bad mood, right? They can be this spiral of negativity that goes down, right? But the key of the affective spiral is that you can seed the positive emotion, right? Like you can be the emotion you want to see in the world or you want to see in your relationship and so on. You just have to seed it. And so don't forget that just simply by embodying the right practices, you can allow other people to catch them. Does that mean that if you do a gratitude journal and you're feeling positive that negative person in your life is going to like switch gears completely? No, right? But you can take small actions that do have some consequences on other people's mood. The second piece of advice, though, is to kind of engage these sort of like caregiving processes we talked about right? Some compassion, right? This is a spot where if you're dealing with an especially tough to deal with person or an especially negative person, that you can wind up using the power of compassion to, again, not necessarily even change their mood, but allow yourself to be more okay with it. Part of the thing that comes of somebody else's negative mood is it's bad. It's one of those first arrows, but our reaction to our judgment against it, the fact that we get so pissed off at, our spouse or whatever, like that's the second arrow that we have some control over. And a way to control that is through compassion. So try out some loving kindness meditation where you actually extend compassion to that person who's the negative person in your life. May you be happy. May you be free from harm. May you be safe, right? And when you do that practice, sometimes you get these really deep insights. I've been doing this a little bit myself. I like work with lots of people, and most of the people I work with are fantastic. But there's a couple people that I find really hard to deal with. And I'll be honest that sometimes my second arrow there isn't great. I make it worse by getting frustrated about that sort of thing, right? But the process of doing loving kindness meditation has really helped me, right? When I experience that person, feeling kind of like expressing negativity or doing something bad, I don't get like pissed off anymore. I get this like caregiving urge of like, gosh, I just want you to be safe, right? And I end up going into nurturing mode rather than sort of feeling frustrated mode. And I think, looking through the questions about dealing with negative people, sometimes it seems like the people are getting so upset about it. And again, it's an upsetting thing. Like, I completely get it. But the point is that that's a thing that you have control over. That's a spot where you can harness a different emotion rather than frustration that will allow you to kind of be a caregiver that might allow them, like the less frustration, the less you're going to make it worse. But sometimes those caregiving skills mean that you can start nurturing in a way that you didn't do it before. And that can be really powerful for increasing the other person's well-being too. But even in a pinch, if you can't change anything about their state, you can change your own state and you can change your reaction to it.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've seen before is the four agreements. I think one of the things that sometimes happens is that we take it personal, that, the negativity. And again, I've seen it talked about how what maybe other people's opinion of us is their business, not ours in some ways. And I think it's easier said than done, though. I mean, we don't get it right all the time, because sometimes, we all have instances where people that really, mean a lot to us, and unfortunately, sometimes the people that mean the most to us can sometimes hurt us the most.
Definitely, definitely. And I think that's where, again, harnessing these emotions like compassion can be really powerful, right? Because again, we can get on these cycles, right? Somebody else says something mean and then we beat ourselves up, but then, they said one mean thing, but it's in our heads for months and months where we keep repeating it and ruminating on it and stuff. And again, that's something that if we had the right techniques of self-compassion, we could control. And so again, there's a lot, even if you can't necessarily affect the emotions of the other person, there's a lot of things that you can affect within yourself that will allow you to be happier, even though they haven't changed, and allow you to navigate the situation with them better and with less frustration, even though they haven't really changed.
Got another question here. I'm going to shift gears a little bit again. This one is, usually in these type of seminars, we speak about the well-being in a more hedonistic way. I would like to know a little bit more about the eudaimonic well-being during COVID. Is engaging in meaningful activities or self-growth activities, having a purpose or stuff like that can help coping in COVID times? Are there studies on this?
Yeah. So one thing is worth kind of digging into some of those terms for folks that are less familiar with them, if you haven't fully taken my Yale class, right? And so when we think about like happiness from a hedonistic perspective, most people kind of get this concept of hedonism, right? It's like sort of happiness within a moment, right? Like eating good things or, like having good things to savor, like joy, right? Which is important, right? We want to kind of, those are good things to bump up to. But hedonism is a little bit different than this other concept of happiness, which is this idea of eudaimonia, right? Which is a kind of concept that goes back to Aristotle and the Greeks, where they thought about sort of happiness in terms of like a sort of spiritual happiness or sort of finding meaning or sort of a bigger form of happiness, right? And so the question is really asking, like, how can we support that? Some of the things we talked about, savor and, pay attention to stuff and be present, those are more on the hedonism side. What about the meaning side? And I think that part is really important too, right? We need to find ways that we are like allowing ourselves to do something that gives us purpose, right? That gives us a bigger meaning, that gives us awe. And I think this is a spot which gets back to the comment we talked about before about self-care not being selfish. And there's sort of a flip side of that, which is that sometimes the most appropriate act of self-care is to do for others. Sometimes the most appropriate act of self-care is to do something that's bigger than ourselves, that requires some self-sacrifice, that feels really meaningful. And I think this is another kind of meditation, kind of getting back to techniques that healthcare workers can use. I think, people are say like, oh, you're a hero. And I know healthcare workers didn't sign up to be heroes, but it's worth reflecting on the kind of good that you've done in the world, especially for people who are on the front lines of COVID. Like, you are literally saving lives. In some cases, you've allowed a person's death to be less awful and less lonely than it would have been before, right? These are awful, hard to deal with things. But if you think about the fact that you are doing something really meaningful, that you're really changing someone's lives and families' lives, this can be quite powerful. And so my kind of advice for sort of finding eudaimonic happiness in the context of COVID is to find ways to become a little bit more other oriented, right? Don't make it about your happiness. Think about ways that you can do good in the world. And there are lots of different ways to do that. Actually, one of my former students started a whole program called Helping Hands. He was, a Yale student who was like home during COVID. He got kicked out over spring break and he was back, feeling kind of helpless. And he started a program where he got other young people like him who, maybe have less risk of not necessarily catching the virus, but, less potential harm or less horrible consequences if they catch it. And so he went out and sort of set up a program where he had older and elderly individuals call him for groceries and what they wanted, and he would go pick them up for them and sort of deliver them, sort of like a personal Instacart service, where he also could like kind of meet with them in masks and things and just like, socially distance, like check in on them and do that stuff. And he said that, even though he'd gotten into Ivy League school, even though he had like, all his major and all his things, that this was the most important thing he's ever done, that these practices changed his life. And he knows he's helping people, but he thinks the whole practice of doing that has helped him more. And I think that's the thing about eudaimonic happiness. It starts with a gesture where you're really trying to do something selfless for someone else, but it ends up benefiting us a lot more.
What, when you talk about what specific ways can people check in, again, we're distanced, we talked about Zoom and various other things. And what ways would you suggest that people can connect these days, outside of obviously social media? What kind of little things can people do that can go a long way?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the good old fashioned phone call, right? A powerful way to do this, right? The good old fashioned letter. Could you write a letter to someone? Imagine, all those days and you get the mail and it's just boring stuff and someone gets a handwritten letter from you, or a postcard, right? Again, these are, it like seems so simple, but, it just takes a little bit, even a text, right? The other day, someone I hadn't talked to in a long time, he's like, hey, I'm just checking on you. I know you live on campus. This must be really scary. I just was thinking of you and was wondering how it was going. That took that person probably 14 seconds to type that text. It changed my day completely that they checked in with me, right? And so we have these like powers to use small amounts of time and small amounts of energy to have these like huge kinds of effects, right? And so just think of simple ways that you can do it. If you're the type of person who has a little bit of, extra money, maybe you're not paying for your commute these days or something like that, or not going out to restaurants as much, like, can you spend that for a good cause? Many of us don't have extra money right now, but some of us have a little bit of extra time, right? You're getting these little time windfalls, could use that time to do something nice for somebody else. And even if you don't have extra money or extra time, can you use those 5 seconds extra seconds you would have spent on Instagram, the what else like question we asked, could that be a time that you text a friend real quick or send a quick email to someone and sort of check in on how they're doing? Again, not a lot of time that we need to spend to have this big ripple effect out there.
One of the other emotions, obviously, and we touched upon there, and you said in healthcare, being able to kind of support people even in the death process or in the illness process. There was some questions surrounding the emotion of grief. And one person had asked, and these are two things: how do I deal with the death of a loved one? And also someone that was dealing with divorce during COVID. These are hard enough times that, I think that our baseline, as we know, unhappiness in some ways is at a all-time high. How do people deal with grief at this time?
Yeah, well, this might sound a little bit strange to say, but in some ways, if you're going through an awful, awful time, the research suggests that it's good to pack those in. There's this research suggesting that we should sort of split up our gains, like all the good things in life, and kind of combine the losses, right? And the reason is that the way happiness really works is happiness is our detection of a change from baseline. So when something good happens, you kind of go up. But if you had two good things happen in a row, like there's kind of a diminishing return to how far up you can go. And the same, sadly, is true for bad times. In some ways, it would be bad if we had a year that was a polarized election, we were so stressed, and then we went back to baseline. And then we had a year that was a horrible pandemic, and we were really stressed, we went back to baseline. And then we had a year of awful social justice challenges when we had to deal with anti-Black movements, and then went back to baseline. Like, in some ways, the fact that 2020 is so bad, like we're at max crappy, right? Like we couldn't get any crappy, right? So in some ways, if you had to combine a year where you got divorced and had the pandemic, it's good to squish it all in. And again, I'm not being flippant here. This is really in some ways, what the science suggests. So it was a smart strategy to sort of squeeze it in. But of course, this makes an already awful pandemic even worse, right? And so what can you do to handle this stuff? Things like death of a family member or death of a loved one, things like an awful divorce, these are things that are just gonna be awful, right? Again, we are not superhumans. We are not these robots. We will normatively feel sad and need to grieve these awful things. And I think we just need to give ourselves space to actually do that. RAIN is a really powerful process for this. In fact, Tara Brach talks specifically about using RAIN for sadness and grief to give yourself some space. What if you did 5 minutes every day where you processed it? Again, it sucks. Part of grief is it sucks and we just don't want to deal with it. So we try to distract ourselves, whether that's eating something or going on social media or pretending it's fine. These emotions aren't going to go away. We need to give ourselves some space to feel them. And you might hear the kind of, stiff upper lip advice of oh, just get over it, or, oh, just don't feel that, or suppress your emotions. Turns out this is a really awful strategy. There's science suggesting emotions just don't go away. You kind of have to feel them. But also, if you don't feel them, if you suppress them, there are these really specific negative consequences that come for that. So one study by the Stanford psychologist James Gross and his colleagues had subjects sort of suppress sad emotions. So you watch a sad movie and you have to kind of suppress your sadness, much, much smaller than grief, right? But even suppressing a little sad emotion from the movie. He tells subjects, whatever you do, don't feel the emotion, try to suppress it. What does he find? Well, he finds that those subjects experience cognitive changes because they're suppressing their emotions. They actually do worse on a memory test. You see memory loss. But he actually finds even in that small experience in a laboratory setting that people experience cardiac stress when they're trying to suppress their emotions. So you actually can see that their heart is working overtime in this moment where they're trying to suppress stuff, right? And these are again, college students who've watched a sad movie. Imagine dealing with the grief of losing a loved one in the context of COVID-19, right? So we can't just pretend this stuff is fine. We need space to express this stuff. And so RAIN is a practice you can use to do this. Journaling is a practice that you can use to do this. There's a wonderful episode of my podcast where we talk about the benefits of journaling with the researcher Jamie Pennybaker, who's at UT Austin. And he talks about a journaling practice that he did with Holocaust survivors. And just the act of allowing them to journal, allowing them to narratively express their own grief, allows them to get over it faster, but it also allows them to live longer, right? So this act of kind of allowing you to express your grief and giving it some space can be really quite powerful. So I would say commit to a RAIN practice, grab a notebook, but give yourself some space to actually grieve and experience it. And that's true for big losses. It's also true for small losses too. This was the advice I gave to my 2020 Yale students who missed out on their graduation, missed out on the big senior proms and all that stuff. Some of them were saying, I feel bad being so sad because, people are dying, but that's a real loss too. And losses require some grief.
Yeah. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to specifically some questions surrounding the holidays. And there was another one that had come in as well. And I think that here's one question. It says, I find now that the holidays are here and are becoming more, that person is becoming more and more depressed. Telephone calls with friends and family are not doing it for me anymore. I find that I'm missing the human contact more and more, and I'm looking for suggestions to keep things from becoming too depressing. And then we'll probably I'll stop with that. And then there's a follow-up about, what to do about kids around the holidays, which, again, that's it's a very important holiday season for kids and how to deal with those issues surrounding that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think again, the first thing is to recognize and validate that this sucks, right? That there's grief here, right? I think what this person's expressing is kind of coming in like, the Hallmark TV shows are coming out. We're seeing like the lights and things, and our emotion is like deep sadness, right? That's because we got to grieve the fact that this sucks and this wasn't the year we wanted. And, we're missing traditions that some of us care about a lot. Those folks that know me know that I'm not really that into the Christmas holidays. I'm not a big like winter holidays person, but I'm a huge Halloween fan. And to be totally honest, that I was floored. Despite all my techniques of being a happiness expert, I was floored for the entire month of October. I didn't buy a single pumpkin, which those that know me know is like, like a strong statement. But the entire season made me deeply depressed. And it took me a long time to realize, like, wait, I'm just grieving this time of the year and this sort of all these cultural traditions that I love that I can't do in the same way anymore. And honestly, it was really hard. And in some ways, it was funny as a kind of happiness expert to see that ahead of time, because I realized, like, I'm going through this at Halloween. A lot of other people are going to get an even bigger dose of this during the winter holidays, where I think there's a lot more togetherness, a lot more kind of culture surrounding the importance of Christmas and Hanukkah and all these other things. And so this is normal. This is like what's supposed to happen. And I think we need to call it, right? You need to call your loved ones that you're missing these things and be like, this sucks. I'm sad that we can't get together, right? I'm sad that we can't do holidays the same way, right? So I think that's sort of thing number one. Thing number two is to kind of, again, go back to the basics of what gives you joy, right? If nothing else, like do that half hour of exercise, right? Just force yourself, commit with a friend to do it, commit to those kinds of things. And if you can't do the half hour, do baby steps, right? When you're in the throes of that kind of sadness and grief about, this time of year, it's going to be hard to even like do these techniques. But can you do 3 minutes, 2 minutes, get a friend to help you out with it, commit to doing something with you. Those things can be quite powerful. The final thing, though, is to try to take a moment to recognize some of the parts of this that are good. Again, most 99.99% of this pandemic is just sucky, and we would never want it back. We want it to go away as quickly as possible. But there's a small part of the stuff that's happening that's kind of good if we allow ourselves to admit it, right? Many of us like, oh gosh, remote learning and this sucks and whatever, but it's kind of cool to have our families around more often, right? I'm sad that I can't, a few years ago, we did this event in New Bedford at the Whaling Museum, and it was amazing. I'm sad that I can't do it all together with you. But
Right.
right now I'm wearing fuzzy socks and I couldn't do that at the Whaling Museum. Little, happy things that are going on, right? And I think if we look carefully, we're going to see that in the holidays too, right? Sometimes the holidays can be incredibly stressful because everything's so frantic. We're so time famished. There's so much going on, right? There's a lot of stress. Now we get to kind of pick and choose the parts that we like. And there's something that's pretty good about that. We can embrace over the holiday season what's called JOMO. Many of us have heard this term FOMO, which is the sort of fear of missing out. But we can have in some ways a sort of JOMO, which is the joy of missing out on some things. I'm sad about so many aspects of the holiday season, not being able to see my family members and so on. But holiday work party number 42, I'm happy that that's off the list. I'm happy that I get to, spend the evening with my husband having a nice meal rather than going to, work holiday I didn't want to go to. And so I think if you're kind of dealing with the holiday grief, it might be good to kind of think about, what are the things that you really loved about it? And can you kind of build those up? That work can also be powerful too, because you get to figuring out what are the things you really cared about. Right now I'm like, oh my gosh, we can't do the dinner. We're not doing the cookie tradition or whatever. My guess is if you like dig in and look more closely, it wasn't about the cookies. It was about the togetherness, right? And so the question is like, what can you do to get the togetherness? Maybe you do it over Zoom. Maybe you watch a movie together. You can find substitutes that really do feel nourishing if you figure out the nugget that you really loved. And that can be a fun conversation with family members, right? Talking about the grief of this stuff, of what you miss kind of, and what you really do love, and how you can build that back in some form this holiday season.
One of the things that I really admire about is your transparency at times about, when you're in a situation where you acknowledge around Halloween that you were experiencing these things. And I think that one of the things that happens is that, we as as physicians, as doctors, as teachers, as professors, we don't get it right all the time. And we have to have the insight and the ability to realize, like you said, I'm not getting it done the right way, et cetera. And I think that that's one of the things that the genuine humility that you have to say, hey, sometimes this is the way I feel. So I appreciate that. One of the things that was brought up here, and again, as I've tried to, that I actually don't like the term social distancing, because what happens is that I've kind of tried to use the phrasing of physical distancing and social connection. But that does, again, one of the things that, especially as a physician, touch is important, right? Being able to examine the patient. And for a lot of people, touch is really, hugging. Some people are huggers, some people aren't huggers, and not being able to shake a hand and some of these simple gestures. And one of our questions that we had was, this lack of physical contact. How can we deal with not being able to high five? How do we deal with not being able to give someone a hug when they need it? Whether that hug is in joy or for sorrow, for example, for consoling someone. So what do you think about what can we do to deal with this lack of physical contact?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one, right? There are a lot of ways we can hack forms of social connection using technology. Touch isn't a great one yet, right? I'm sure there's some special startup in Silicon Valley where they're getting to hug you and things, but we don't, it's not like Zoom. It's not something we all have, right? So this is one that's going to admittedly be pretty tough. But again, there are ways we can sort of hack the system. What is the touch system about, right? That touch system, when you reach out and give someone a hug, that is the compassion system in action, right? It's a physical form of compassion in action. But there are other ways we can kind of hack that. And in fact, researcher Kristen Neff, who I mentioned before, she's this expert in in self-compassion. She actually advocates self-touch when we're trying to be self-compassionate. She freely admits, I kind of admitted before, this sounds cheesy and it feels really weird the first time you do it, but you can hug yourself. You can kind of embrace yourself, right? Turn yourself into a little ball and give yourself a hug. You can give yourself soothing. It's actually one of the techniques that she recommends when you're doing positive self-talk of and during rain, for example, when you're doing the nurture part, it's okay. It's okay. Again, is that as good as seeing your best friend and getting a hug? No, we're admitting that, right? But these are hacks that your body will respond to. Your body just knows oh, that's a hug, right? You're sending the right chemicals in to make your body feel like it would feel if someone was giving you a hug. And so it is actually one way to do it. I've started ending Zoom calls with friends of mine who I would normally hug, I was first seeing them, or hug goodbye. We do self hug. So it's hug, and I see them like this. And so again, at first it feels weird, but ultimately your body's getting the same effect, right? And so try to hack that system. It can actually be quite powerful.
One of the things that we have struggled with this year, and especially in healthcare, again, what we've struggled with is getting people to sometimes realize that until we get a vaccine, that distancing, wearing masks, hygiene and appropriate testing and isolating ourselves if we have symptoms, obviously, are so appropriate. And, one of the challenges has been that there has been, as you said at the beginning, not everybody's doing that. And, one of the questions was, how do you handle a situation where people aren't doing the right thing, perhaps, and maybe gathering? And, again, I'm very well aware of several instances where we've had spreader events where people have maybe had that Halloween party that we all missed that actually led to a small outbreak. And, and I think there's a certain frustration for those that have done the right things to then see that others are not. So when somebody's in a situation where they see and are frustrated with people that may not be doing the things that we've asked from a public health perspective, how do you deal with witnessing that? And what is your advice to that?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple components here. So one is if, this is a person that you maybe could affect their behavior if you have a conversation with them or something like that. I think this is actually one of the biggest tensions that we're seeing in the holiday season, even at a time when, politics is polarized and kind of mess with us around the Zoom, Thanksgiving table and so on. I think the biggest stressor we're all having is that we just have different levels of expectation around COVID norms, right? And to be totally fair, I don't think our government, at least in the U.S., is giving us clear signals, right? So it makes it harder because no one's forcing us. We have to kind of come up with it on our own and in our families and things, and that can lead to tension. If someone thinks like no meeting at all, and someone thinks, well, maybe we could do it outside, or somebody thinks, well, how about we do it inside but with masks? Like, those are real differences that can cause some stress. But part of it is the research suggests actually comes from the fact that we often don't have accurate perceptions of what other people really think, right? So sometimes, basically, what the research shows is that we think the conflict is bigger than it is, right? Everybody's kind of uncertain right now, and maybe has different norms about whether they're prioritizing the connection part or the health part, right? But the research suggests if you sincerely, especially in terms of the health, express your worries about it, people often will hear you better than you think they'll hear you. That's what the research really suggests. So if you're facing a situation like that and you say, hey, I've thought about this really carefully, and based on my health or the health of my family members or things I'm really seeing in my community, I'm just not comfortable with that. I really worry about your health, and this is something that I'd really like you to hear because I care about you and I love you, right? It's coming from this place of compassion, right? And that gets to the second thing I wanted to mention, which is sort of the other part, which is like, if you're just seeing this stuff and you're just like angry at those folks that are doing it. And I get it, right? Like, I'm very COVID scared, and I get really angry when I see people kind of doing things that I think is, endangering the health of the community. But that's where the sort of compassion practice about people you disagree with can be really powerful, right? Sometimes when I do that sort of loving kindness meditation practice, I often do think of like, people that are difficult for me right now are like these people that are like, why are you doing this stupid stuff and endangering people? And when I do the compassion practice, what I often realize is like, they just don't have the same information as me, or maybe they have other constraints than me. Maybe they're like, feeling loneliness more deeper than I am, or maybe they just like, aren't getting the same news that I have. Maybe they don't have the same scientific information that I have, right? And so you can kind of come to them, not from a place of pity, but again, a place of compassion, that when you deal with them, it's not out of anger and frustration of like, the heck with you, that you don't care about other humans, like what a jerk. Like, you come from compassion of like, I'm so sorry you didn't get the right information, but caring about you, I really think you should hear this, right? And so, when you give people advice through compassion, they hear it really differently than when you give advice out of anger and frustration, right? And so that's sort of the technique, is kind of harnessing the compassion and really expressing it in terms of how much you love that person. And I think when you have the hard conversations like that, the like, I'm not coming home for Christmas conversation, or the like, I really don't think that we have the right norms here, and I think I'm going to disappoint you, and how I'm going to behave or something, like, that's sort of really the way to do it.
I think time for about maybe one more question. There was one that came up regarding in the chat about the emotional well-being of kids and in relationship to online schooling. So I guess one of the things that there's been many states, including Massachusetts, and that have or various states are trying to prioritize in-person versus online schooling. And I guess the question is what is the data surrounding online schooling in terms of kids' emotional well-being?
Yeah, I mean, the honest answer is we don't have great data now, right? Because it's not just, do kids learn online? It's, do
Right.
kids learn online when suddenly snapped out of their schools in the midst of a global pandemic, right? What we know is that a lot of students from many different grade levels are experiencing some mental health stuff right now, right? There's frustration in terms of the way the learning works. Like, the learning itself doesn't feel like it's going as well. Kids are feeling really lonely, but most are feeling kind of out of sorts, right? Just because their routine has been sort of messed up. Just as it's hard for many of us who have to work from home because we get distracted, all that stuff is even worse, if you're a 7-year-old, right, who's trying to engage with this stuff. And I think it's like a little bit of affective spiral, right? It's also annoying for the teachers, like all the teachers out there who have to like teach second graders remotely, like that kind of sucks for the teachers too, right? So it's kind of bad all around. And I think as a parent, one thing you should recognize is first to validate that, right? Don't make your kid do stiff upper lip and just get through it, whatever. Validate, be like, turn on your compassion, like, this sucks. Like, it sucks. It's not going to be forever, right? There are vaccines on the horizon. It's just for a little while. But like, let's recognize that it sucks. What can I do to nurture you? What can I do to help you be frustrated, right? And help you not be so frustrated all the time. And I think, this is the kind of nurturing that we can turn on. Allow kids to talk about it. Allow kids to talk about the fact that, it's been tough, right? A second thing I think we can do is to kind of harness the power of habits to make it a little bit better. Part of the problem with remote learning is that it's just easier to pay attention and focus and do school stuff if your situation looks like school. Just like it's easier for us to work when we work, in office, if we're used to being in office, to do that in office than it is to do at the kitchen table. So too is it for kids, right? Part of the problem is that they just don't have the right environment or the right routine, right? Routines, we're really creatures of habit in ways we don't expect. Our routines matter a lot. And so one way you can really help as a parent is to like institute routines, even if they're dumb and fake, right? Wake up at the same time, right? We're going to have breakfast together, and then you're going to go to school. Have a specific spot in your house that is school, right? That you sort of set up, and then when school is over, have a sort of ritual of we end of the day, like you walk home from school, you have some ritual where you kind of end the day together, whatever that looks like. And those things, they sound silly, but they're really ways to hack our kind of habit system to kind of get us to say, okay, this is sort of how it works, right? And then I think it's also just to be, as we've talked about, that sort of part of self-compassion is realizing like, we're not going to be the best spouses or employees or, like fitness addicts or creative types or whatever. Like they're not going to be the best students, right? And that's okay. This is temporary. Like they will catch up and it's okay. It's a time to kind of allow for compassion and to help them come to terms with their own compassion too, right? Because that part of like drill sergeanting and beating ourselves up, like that didn't just start when we were adults, right? Sometimes that starts even in childhood. And so getting your kids to engage in practices that allow for self-compassion can also be quite helpful too.
Well, I want to thank you so much for spending time tonight. And I also want to thank all the various organizations that co-hosted and collaborated, and all the people across really the world that tuned in tonight. I think that we're entering in the 12th round of COVID-19, so to speak, for 2020. And, there's a lot of people out there with anxiety, uncertainty, but we're going to get through this, no doubt. And I'd like you just to say a few words in closing, if people could take a few take-home messages, to inspire them through the season. And again, so grateful for you coming on, and I'm going to let you close it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll close it out the way I began, which is it is normal to not feel normal right now. It is normal to not be okay. And we need to allow that for ourselves with a little bit of self compassion. We need to validate that for those around us. And we need to do the best we can. But one way to do that is to make sure that you're reaching out to other people as much as possible. Again, the resilience that you build up through these habits that we talked about for yourself can be quite powerful. But those little tiny acts of using 3 minutes here and there to check in on the people who are struggling can mean that we're really getting through this crisis in a more communal way. And that can help you by boosting your happiness by doing nice things for others, but it can also help everyone else as well.